In 1988, a family digging under a Kansas farm field found a steamboat. Not wreckage, not scattered planks. A working riverboat sealed whole in mud, nearly half a mile from the nearest water. Inside, the cargo was still there. Shoes still paired, bottles still sealed, tools still wrapped. And in one box, addressed to Thompson and Butts at Council Bluffs, 150 pounds of lead type that had been ordered for a newspaper and never arrived. The easy story is buried treasure. The real story is stranger and colder. The cargo was not treasure. It was credit, inventory, and winter stock, already promised to people upriver. That is the sentence the records support. It is harder to hold on to than the version about buried bourbon and frontier romance, but it is the one that fits the evidence. On September 5th, 1856, the Steamboat Arabia struck a submerged tree trunk on the Missouri River near Kansas City. The Snag caught the hull forward of the boilers. The boat began to go down before the passengers had time to understand the sound. Freight shifted. Water came across the deck. Arabia sank in roughly 2 minutes. It was not an unusual kind of disaster. The Missouri did not need a storm. It needed wood, current, mud, and a pilot with 1 second too few. A snag was a fallen or submerged tree the current had anchored against the bottom. On this river, the banks were always giving way, and the trees that came with them did not always travel far before being fixed in place. Some broke the surface, most did not. A boat moving upstream at working speed could find a snag when the hull found it, not when the pilot found it. Arabia had been built at West Brownsville, Pennsylvania in 1853. She was 171 feet long, wooden-hulled, and designed for exactly this trade. People, federal mail, frontier tools, general store merchandise, and whatever a string of river towns needed to last the season. At roughly 200 tons of cargo capacity, she was not a vessel built for legend. She was built for a route. She left St. Louis for the last time at the end of August 1856 and worked her way upriver through the ordinary geography of the Western trade. By September 5th, she had reached the stretch near Kansas City with work still ahead of her. She was not at the end of her run. She was in the middle of it. One passenger left a first-hand account of what happened next. Abel D. Kirk had just been married near Peoria and was traveling with his wife toward Nebraska. His account carries no drama for its own sake. He placed himself at supper when the impact came. Chairs and stools thrown about, children nearly falling, men taking the lifeboat first and then coming back for the women. The bank was steep and caving. Kirk climbed it and helped women up behind him. The survivors were taken to Parkville. Even before Arabia finished sinking, belongings stacked near the river were broken into. The loss did not wait for archaeology. Only one creature aboard did not survive. A mule tied on deck. The record does not say more than that. Once the people were accounted for, the emergency changed shape. The question was no longer who could be saved. It was what had just become a claim. The Kansas City Enterprise reported a total loss on September 6th. By September 11th, the Daily Missouri Democrat had published a consignee statement from clerk James Spencer listing the freight destinations, hull policies, cargo policies, named merchants, named towns. What those records show is insurance exposure and named consignees across a network of supply commitments. Thompson and Butts, Council Bluffs, Armstrong and Clark, Lumber, Omaha, Keller, Lumber, Florence, Tracy and Papin, Packages and Houses, Logan. Further upriver still, Sioux City, Blackbird Hill, Decatur, Tacoma. Each entry was a name. Each name was a place where something had been expected and was not going to arrive. The consignee list is where the ship stops being a sunken object and becomes a map of interrupted obligations. Every package in the hold had already been imagined somewhere else before the snag was ever struck. One entry pointed to Thompson and Butts at Council Bluffs. That name would not mean much on its own. In the recovered cargo, that name returned on a box. Inside was lead type. 150 pounds of it. The working letters of a newspaper that had been ordered, packed, loaded onto Arabia, sunk, buried under a shifting river, and finally returned 132 years later without ever having printed the thing it was meant to print. The records connect Thompson and Butts to a political paper at Council Bluffs. The box was not a curiosity for a future museum. It was words, argument, a small public voice waiting upriver, dependent on freight that was now at the bottom of the Missouri. The rest of the cargo tells the same kind of story, without names: shoes, tools, beads, clothing, bottles, food, knives, doorknobs. Behind glass, preserved for a century and a half, they can look almost decorative. In 1856, they were not decorative. Lumber meant building. A sawmill meant work for a settlement that had not yet stabilized. Frame houses meant someone had already pictured walls where there were not yet walls, and committed money and wait time to that picture. The cargo was not an assortment. Every item had a destination before it had a display case. Hawley and Hartley described the whiskey story, which circulated after the sinking, as a rumor. The actual cargo records point somewhere less glamorous and more useful. Not one treasure, but dozens of named obligations. Not a single find, but a network of deliveries that never happened. The treasure version asks what was aboard. The record version asks who was waiting. Kirk saw the top of the pilot house for a moment after the sinking, and then that too was gone. Arabia disappeared once into the Missouri, and then again into something slower. The channel shifted over the following decades. The Missouri moved roughly half a mile from where it had run in September 1856. Mud became bottomland. Bottomland became a farm field. The wreck stayed where the river had left it, sealed 45 feet underground, inside conditions the surface world never replicated. After the newspaper notices, the record thins. For more than a century, Arabia is mostly rumor, failed searches, and a location the river no longer marked. This is the gap, not hours this time, but generations, between the moment a cargo was written off and the moment it could finally answer back. In 1988, the Hawley family and their partners did not dive for Arabia. They excavated, against mud, against the rising water table, against time measured in months. The work ran about 4.5 months. What came up was a pre-Civil War artifact collection unlike anything previously recovered from the Western River trade. The recovery was not glamorous in the way the treasure version of the story required. It was methodical and wet, the kind of work that produces evidence rather than spectacle. The museum draw is real. Case after case of intact goods can make 1856 feel immediate in a way a ledger never could. Shoes still paired, bottles still sealed, fabric still folded. But the objects are only half the evidence. The other half is the question that belongs with every case. Who was this for? The goods did not survive to become antiques. They survived inside a transaction that never completed. The financial records are the sharper story, but only if they are kept honest. They show insurance exposure. They show named consignees. They do not prove every private debt behind the cargo, and they do not need to. The names already in the record are enough. The gap between what was sent and what arrived is already the story. A merchant in Council Bluffs waited for type. A builder waited for lumber. A store waited for shelves to fill. The river did not just sink cargo, it stopped arrivals. Arabia's power is not that the cargo survived unused. It is that the cargo survived named. In the recovered cargo was a box addressed to Thompson and Butts at Council Bluffs. Inside was lead type. 150 pounds of letters ordered for a newspaper. The type did not print anything after it came up. It went into a museum case. The last human image is not a ship in mud. It is type for a newspaper that did not get to print the way its owner intended.